Hi, Pat the Podcaster is here. In this day and age, everyone and their nan has a podcast. And with incredible tools like Adobe Podcasts making the medium more accessible than ever, anyone can do it. Well, in today's episode, the boys talk all things podcasting, and Lloyd reveals his guilty pleasure podcast.
But I listen to Fern Cotton's That Happy Place. A load of women similar to me talking about mental health and sex and their careers.
And Dan reveals the original name for the podcast that didn't make the cut.
A lot of people don't know this, but we wanted to call this podcast Business Wankers because that's the vibe of the podcast. We thought that we wouldn't be able to rank in like Apple Podcasts, Spotify if we had wankers in the title.
So we just put the wankers in the thumbnail.
And Lloyd reveals a surprising statistic about podcast listeners to bring comfort to the average podcast host.
To be in the top 50%, you only have to have 30 listens per episode.
That is mad.
Now, before we dive in, we'd like to take a second to thank our sponsors, Adobe Express. Adobe Express allows you to quickly and easily create standout social graphics, logos, flyers, and more on web and mobile. Click the link in the description to try Adobe Express today. Right, let's dive in. This is episode 148 of the Business Anchors podcast.
We're just a couple of business anchors. Welcome to the Business Anchors podcast. This jingle is slightly too long. This jingle is slightly too long.
Dan, how can you create a podcast that drives £1 million plus revenue?
Let me tell you a story. I actually want to start with a story.
Okay,
So
I'm listening.
In February 2020, we had an idea. You know, Lloyd, we always focus at least 20% of our marketing on trying and testing something completely new. And in February 2020, all those years ago, that new thing was this podcast.
Oh, this is a great bedtime story. I'm feeling sleepy already.
No, it's going to get more exciting.
Okay.
So we started the podcast in February 2020. And I don't know if any of you other anchors, if you listen to other kind of marketing podcasts like we did, but we saw a gap in the market because in the charts a lot and lots of other great marketing podcasts are very informative. They teach you, how to do this, how to do that. Very step-by-step and informative, but they're not, I personally didn't find them that like really funny and interesting and to listen to. They were
Whereas we...
No.
Oh.
I'm not big. No. So the gap in the market was that. Lots of very fun, lots of very informative educational marketing podcasts, but they're not the type of thing we'd want to listen to. Did you feel similar?
Yes, I think there was one or two businessy podcasts that I enjoyed. Well, to be honest, didn't really enjoy. I'd listen to and try to learn things, but there weren't any that I enjoyed and like look forward to and might have a laugh or that kind of thing within it. Definitely.
Exactly. So we saw a gap in the market to produce an educational marketing and business podcast, Business Anchors, but also try and make it a bit more fun and interesting to listen to by telling interesting stories and making you, the listener, feel like you're with your mates having a chat. Because we're brothers, we've known each other for quite a few years now. And
how long have you known me, Dan?
31 years. Well, I didn't know you when I was a newborn baby, did I really? But
well, I was there.
You were there. Anyway, so I feel like we can have good discussions and stuff. And hopefully this is a podcast that's educational and you find fun to listen to. And Business Anchors was born. Interesting backstory. A lot of people don't know this, but we wanted to call this podcast Business Wankers because that's the vibe of the podcast. We're just two
business wankers
talking about business and marketing and lessons we're learning rather than trying to be like something we're not.
Just two business wankers finishing each other's
sandwiches.
Wayo.
But we thought that we wouldn't be able to rank in like Apple Podcasts, Spotify if we had wankers in the title, which kind of makes sense, right?
Yeah.
They'd probably demote that and we want more people listening to this.
So we just put the wankers in the thumbnail.
So we just put the wankers in the thumbnail.
Hello.
So we started Business Anchors in February 2020. Now, the honest story is for the first year, we lost a lot of money in the sense of we were putting a huge amount of resource into producing this podcast. Like we create lots of video content for it and lots of short clips for social and write a whole write-up on our website, businessanchors.inc. Like
we were paying people's wages to put lots of effort into this podcast. And we certainly didn't have income to cover that from the podcast.
And the whole objective of this podcast was and is to make it interesting to listen to for marketers and founders and to ultimately demonstrate the good work we do to hopefully attract some customers along the way. So we were failing.
Well,
no. So
yeah, I suppose we were.
Well, for the first year, we'd attracted a couple of like new small projects that sort of mentioned the podcast, but like the amount of time and effort we put in, we were failing.
Do you know what though? Saying we were failing, it sounds like, oh my God, that was so shit, and like sob story, like, oh, we had this hard time, we couldn't pay the bills and stuff. But I remember back to that point, I think a part of what kept us going was it was genuinely an enjoyable part of our week.
Yes.
And also like our
It still is.
editor at the time was like enjoyed editing the podcast, and we enjoyed getting creative and the kind of that business journey that we really enjoy. We also had that journey with the podcast and are having that where it's like constantly tweaking and working out what works, what doesn't. So thankfully it wasn't like, oh, we hate this and we're not making any money from it. So that definitely helped.
I also think personal development wise, I don't know if you feel like this. I feel like making yourself sit down every week or every 2 weeks to talk about lessons you're learning and interesting things makes you think about it more. And for me, it's just helped me get better at communicating my ideas in like a more eloquent way.
Yeah. For Dan, it's really helped him move forward and improve at a lot of things he was failing at. And for me,
you were perfect.
For me, it's been really good to support Dan in that.
Thanks, Lloyd.
That's all right.
So back to the story. So a year of not bringing in enough income and losing lots of money. Then in February 2021, we got a phone call in the office. Such an idiot. We got a phone call in the office from a marketing manager from a new company that was interested in working with us. So we went through the standard process. I had a discovery call with them. The creative team got together, put together a really cool pitch with all these concepts and a plan for how we're going to support them to launch their brand. Got onto the virtual pitch because it was COVID at the time. Got onto the virtual pitch. On comes the marketing manager who I knew. Hello, nice to see you again. That kind of thing.
God, I thought that was him for a minute.
Her.
I thought that was her for a minute there.
But also on the call was the managing director, who was the key decision maker in all of this. Guess what the first thing he said to me was, Lloyd?
Your hair looks pretty shit.
No, he didn't say that.
Oh, okay.
He
just
said,
thinking it.
He said, did Lloyd get his Bitcoin back? Which, for those who don't know, is a reference from a podcast we did years ago, which was to do with Lloyd losing money, loads of money with his Bitcoin.
Please feel free to, after this episode, to listen to that. It's an interesting story. I could have been worth multi-millions. I'm not. Lost my Bitcoin.
Yeah. So he said that. And at the time I was like, what? Eventually found out he listened to this podcast every week when he goes running. He loves what we do, loves hearing about us. And he basically said, look, I know I want to work with you guys. Let's figure out how we can make it work. And that was the first kind of 6-figure contract we won from the podcast, like 13 months into starting it.
Yep.
And from that point onwards, we've now generated over 50,000 downloads, over £1 million of business from the podcast. That's through new people working for our agency and also through sponsorship. And across that period of not really knowing what we're doing, it's now getting to a point of making over £1 million. We've learned a huge amount of lessons about podcasting, and we're going to share them with you right now.
Yes, we are. And I think what's interesting about our story with growing this podcast is for the amount of listens we have, because we're not the Joe Rogan podcast. We're not in the top 10 UK chart, every week or anything like that. It's not like, oh, Lloyd and Dan have got the most successful podcast in the country when it comes to listens. But I do believe we have one of the most successful podcasts when it comes to income potentially in a lot of podcast categories and that sort of thing. Like Dan said, it's helped us generate over £1 million in revenue. And that really, I don't think many other people with the amount of listens we've got have achieved that. So hopefully you can really learn something from our chat here and how we've kind of done that.
So starting with lesson number 1, for listeners who are thinking, I'm considering starting a podcast, that could help me attract new business and make money. What's your first lesson, Lloyd?
My first lesson, I think everyone that starts a podcast can learn from this, is don't wing it. So the first episode of almost every podcast sounds like this. So we don't really want to be too structured with this. We're just going to have a chat and have a laugh and, we'll just see where it goes. So, we're just going to, talk about things we enjoy and, just have a chat and hopefully you guys will enjoy listening.
Terrible.
Just so you know, they won't enjoy listening. Okay. Now, if you genuinely want to start a podcast more for the fun of it and you don't care about the listener numbers, obviously talk about whatever you want and do as much or as little preparation you want. If it's for enjoyment.
That's a good point.
Yeah. Do whatever makes you happy. And I'm not taking the piss out of that at all. But most people, I think that podcasting is simpler and easier than it is to produce a good podcast that people want to listen to. And because when you listen to a good podcast, it doesn't sound like there's been loads of planning and it doesn't sound really structured. People think, oh yeah, they just have a chat and it's so good. And I listen to every episode, when in reality, all the most successful podcast, or, you know, the vast majority of the most successful podcasts are very structured. They have a team of people planning what's going to be discussed. They have people planning the schedule. They have people timing things to make sure they're on it. They have meetings to discuss what's worked well, what hasn't worked well, and how to change in the future. So although starting out, you know, you don't want to miss out on starting because you're so worried about all the details. You need to be prepared and have a bit of a structure. Otherwise, it will just sound like you having a chat and it won't be interesting to listen to at all.
I think one of the biggest things that helped us, especially me, to structure our podcast right from the start was to listen to other people's podcasts, because that gave us a good insight into what a good structure for a podcast is. If you're like in the weeds listening to some of the other top podcasts in the world, you can get the idea of how you can structure take the best bits from your favorite podcast and then frame your podcast in a way that works for you.
In my opinion, the best podcasts are the ones that sound like people are winging it, and it sounds so free flowing, and it's like just an enjoyable listen, and it's not too, it doesn't sound like it's structured.
We don't have any notes or anything. This is just us winging it completely.
They can't see the notes. Don't tell them. What are your favourite podcasts, Dan? And is there like do you notice a structure that when you listen to podcasts?
I'll tell you, mine have shifted a bit.
Okay.
So previously I'd say my ex-favourite podcast was The Diary of a CEO.
Okay.
Deep dives with celebs, very emotional, understanding their lives and lessons learnt. And I still think some of those episodes are brilliant. I'm now hooked, like genuinely hooked. And this is the only podcast I currently listen to, like every episode, because they release 3 a week and I haven't got enough time to listen to all of them. So I listen to, is My First Million, which is started by the ex-founder of Bebo, Sean Puri, and another guy called Sam.
Such a random throwback, founder of Bebo.
Yeah.
Nice.
I'll tell you the reason I love it. And they've even self-analysed their podcast and talked about this before. The reason I love it, especially I like Sean on it, or Sean, spelt Sean, but Sean, is because he doesn't try to pretend to be something he's not. He doesn't talk to you as if he's above you, you know, talking down to you like, hey, you puny people down there, we've done really good stuff. Look at you. This is what you should do. He talks like a completely normal guy, talks about his mistakes, self-deprecating, and he's just very relatable, and he's very funny, and he shares lots of examples with what he's talking about. And I did say before, he does remind me of you, Lloyd, a little bit.
Funny, relatable. Is he good looking as well?
Yeah.
So we are similar.
Yeah. So it just makes you feel like when I'm listening to it, one, it makes me feel like I like him. He's funny. Like I'm hanging out with my business mates who are like my mates, but they're into business as well. But two,
thanks for that description, Dan. I was thinking, what could that possibly mean? But then you switched the words around, and I thought, clarity.
Well, exactly.
I completely get it.
Exactly. But at the same time, I'm learning a lot because they're talking about they're like have been hugely successful. They're both millionaires. They've made loads of money, and they share really interesting lessons they're learning along the way. So, yeah, that's mine. What about you? Tell me your favourites and why.
My favourite. So something is not a typical podcast, but there's a podcast called Business Wars, which sometimes when you're searching for business anchors, it's quite annoying. It comes up thinking you might want Business Wars,
right.
which you don't.
No.
Just so you know. But Business Wars, it's more like an audio book, but they're in podcast episodes, and they basically tell the story of like big brands and businesses that have like rivalries. Like they'll do a Domino's versus Pizza Hut, and they tell you the history of all the brands and kind of read it like it's a story, and it has a narrative. It's really interesting, and you can learn like business lessons along the way, because you're like, oh wow, how did Domino's overtake Pizza Hut when they were this tiny one pizza shop and stuff? And it's really, I really enjoy it because that has a narrative and it's like a story, but you learn business lessons.
Yeah.
I really like Diary of a CEO, like you said, but I think the more it's gone mainstream and talking to more celebs, I'm enjoying it less.
I never listen to it much now.
I enjoyed it much more when it was more...
He was recording it in a cupboard.
Yeah. I liked it when it was more business conversations as well.
Yeah.
Now it's more like talking to Mel C or
Tell me why you're so depressed.
Yeah.
And it's a bit like,
so
oh,
I've lost
God.
it. And I get it. Like he's now speaking to the general public rather than people interested in business, and that's a
makes
much
sense,
bigger
yeah.
audience. So I get it. It's just less enjoyable for me personally. But they're the main ones that I listen to these days. I also, this is weird because I don't think I'm the audience at all. It's
Not Michelle Obama.
It's probably about, no, I've read her whole book, very good. I think it's about 2% male audience, but I listen to Fern Cotton's That Happy Place.
Oh, that is such a you podcast. That is such a you. Do you know what?
Just a load of women similar to me talking about mental health and sex and their careers.
Do you know what I picture? You listening to this in this phase when you were really in the friend zone with all those girls at school where you were like holding all their bags and stuff. Like, oh my God.
Well, how about picture this? On the way to the shoot yesterday, I was listening to it in my car.
Were you?
So picture that.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah, so that's a few. And again, like all of these podcasts, they have a specific structure, all quite different. But like Business Wars, the one I spoke about, it's a crazy structure of like the production that must go into it.
It's mad, yeah.
Loads. It's like this full narrative, people reading out this. Yeah, it's crazy. The research that must have gone into it. And then you've got something like The Millionaire. Is it My First Million? Sorry.
Yes, yeah.
And that seems
Minimal.
like a more free flowing, but I'm sure that they have, even if
No,
it's
they go with talking points. That's
Yeah.
how they do it. They
a
bullet
Google Doc
points
with bullet points of that's what we're going to cover.
And also sometimes they do more background research. They talk a lot about really successful businesses and why they were successful. So they do research and before going into the episode. So
there's some kind of structure in all of these. I think you have to be extremely talented if you're only going to do a little bit of prep. Like I would say,
I reckon some do though.
I would say
Some successful podcasts do a
well,
small amount.
like your favorite, My First Million. I think that sounds like there's on the less prep end, but they're extremely good at communicating, and you can tell that. Whereas I think I would find it hard to produce a good episode like that. My next point, Dan, I've got another tip, is make sure you actually want to do it, because I think it's so obvious. If I've listened to podcasts where it's like, oh, this is someone who runs a business and feels like they have to record one episode a week because it's part of their marketing plan, and they don't enjoy this, they don't want to do it, and you can tell. And I do think it's really obvious. Like you have to be a bit of a psychopath to be able to pretend like you're really enjoying having a chat and you're actually hating it. And we have had to abandon recordings before because either Dan or I have been stressed about something, so we've come into it really not in the mindset to
get to the end like that wasn't good.
Yeah, because although we're having a conversation, it's basically a performance, isn't it? Like we're performing to thousands of people that listen to the podcast. So you can't be, if you're in your head like, oh, I'm so stressed about this meeting I've got in 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And
not
also trying to be like, let's have this great conversation. Hey. It gets to a point where it's not possible. So
I'm so crap at like pretending to be in that good level if I'm not.
There have been 2 or 3 where we've abandoned because it just can't happen. We're fortunate that Dan and I both enjoy this. So 99% of the time, it's like, oh, great, let's do it. But I think if one of us kind of lost the love for it and didn't enjoy it anymore,
we'd tell very quickly.
You'd be able to tell. And there's been one time I think one of us was ill and we kind of started, and it's like, not only do you sound crap, your brain isn't working quick enough to say anything decent. So and really, like something that I'm trying to work on, because I listen to it, I feel like I sound quite a lot on these podcasts, quite like monotone and boring, and like I don't have much energy. All right. No, don't agree too quick. But really, like you have to be at like 150% of your personality to sound like a normal person on a podcast. I think they say it's the same on TV and stuff. If a presenter just talked to you normally, you'd think like, are they on drugs? Like they sound like they're asleep or something. Like they're trying not to fall asleep. When actually you just have to be extra energetic to seem normal. So it's very hard to do that.
Can I share one of my biggest lessons?
Yeah.
One of my biggest lessons is to focus on making your ideal audience or target market love your podcast and love listening to it before trying to make any money. I think a lot of people who start a podcast go into this the wrong way, and they think, I need to make money or attract new customers or to win new business. What should I do? Start a podcast. What should we do the podcast on? How should we make it good? Not sure, but let's just start a podcast. And it's similar to your thing that you were mentioning. You can tell when people have just done that. There's a really funny viral TikTok, another white boy with a podcast. Have you seen that?
No.
So it's just like taking a mick out of people just starting podcasts for no reason. Definitely look at it if you haven't seen it already. It's a really funny kind of song that they've made up. But it's got a really good point that podcasting feels so saturated now because everyone's just starting one. We've had some funny comments on TikTok taking the piss out of us, like, oh, whose idea was it to start a podcast?
Yeah.
Like, we're just one of them.
One of them was just like, I can't remember. They said it in a really cool way, just like, maybe try something else, mate.
Yeah.
I thought, okay, harsh, but funny.
And this is why I think you need to think of it. Your number one thing when you're starting out, my number one tip for you is, firstly, why are you starting a podcast? Mm-hmm. And then how are you going to help it achieve the thing you want it to achieve? So you may be, like you said, it may be a passion thing, like you're passionate about American football and you want to start a podcast talking about that. But most of the anchors listening are probably in the business marketing world, and it's probably a channel you're looking to use to attract new customers. If that's the case, then you need to think about who are your ideal customers, who you want to listen, who you want to become customers. What will they enjoy listening to? So what topics and information will they enjoy listening to? And two, how are you going to deliver that information in a way that makes them actually enjoy listening to it? Because like we said, the reason we started this podcast is because a lot of the top marketing podcasts tick the box on the education, informative, giving the information needed, but it was delivered in a not so fun way.
I think there's loads of business podcasts and actually loads of podcasts where I've listened to one episode or maybe two, but because it's not entertaining or engaging enough, I haven't become a regular listener because there's nothing drawing me back.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, I know I'll learn from that, but there's nothing that makes me want to listen to that.
And this is why it's so important to, as a starting point, to truly understand what is your unique angle. So I'll give you two examples. Business anchors. Our unique angle is we provide educational content in an entertaining, fun to listen to manner. That's our like niche, right? That's what we're trying to achieve. Hopefully, anchors, you'll tell us that we are doing that.
Are you entertained? No, is that quite?
Are you not entertained?
That's that. Yeah, that one.
Yeah. Second example that I mentioned earlier, Diary of a CEO. What's Steve's unique angle? He deep dives into celebs' lives and gets them to reveal emotional stories and lessons that they've learned from their lives that they wouldn't normally share in other podcasts. That's kind of his unique, and I think it's gone too far that way, like Lloyd said, rather than like actual good business lessons and things.
And what's happened in your childhood to make you have that view then?
Exactly, yeah. It's a lot of that, and then it gets all fluffy and like, yeah. But that's my kind of top lesson starting out.
Nice. And if that's so important to make people love your podcast before you think about making any money, what do you have any guidance on how you make them love it?
Yeah. Firstly, truly understanding them. So it was a lot easier for us at the start because we're marketers and in the marketing world, we know the kind of problems marketers are facing and that kind of thing. And we speak to a lot of them on a day-to-day basis with our customers and things. So it's good to understand their problems and their troubles. And secondly, I think it's always listening to feedback. Like in our Apple reviews and people just commenting on our stuff, there's been lots of times people have provided feedback and we've proactively asked for feedback to really understand. This is why we're constantly trying to improve this podcast, even things like trying to cut the waffle and trying to get to the point quicker. And so it's not slow and things like we're constantly looking for those tiny things that we can improve by 1% by listening to what people are saying. I think that's another really important thing.
Nice.
What do you think?
I think...
Or what, how would you advise an anchor listening who is trying to create a podcast that people actually enjoy listening to?
I think a really hard thing, but a vital thing, is to listen to your own podcast recording.
Oh, no.
And really be self-critical. And some people find being self-critical super easy and they're literally like, I'm so shit, everything's shit. But some people kind of listen and think, oh, that's so good. But I think thinking about be empathetic, put yourself in your listener's shoes, compare yourself to the other top podcasts that they could listen to. Think, why would they listen to my podcast over that? And I think there's elements of how you deliver things. So it might be like, oh, I always say that word. Like every sentence I say that word and it's really annoying to listen to. And that's something to work on so that your listeners don't get annoyed by that.
Yeah.
That's something that I've tried to do over time, but there's always new things I hear myself say or things I do. And I think I could definitely deliver that in a better way. But also the content. So, is that certain point going on a bit too long? Have you repeated yourself too many times? And it's like, hang on, I've already said that thing. I think really analysing it. And if you find it hard to do it yourself, find someone you can trust that will be honest with you, that won't just be nice and say, no, I just loved it. Yeah, I think it's perfect. Because it's like, basically, if you listen to this and it's not your favourite podcast in the world, I want to know why.
I think we're lucky. We've got quite a few friends and family that listen to the podcast that have like messaged a few times saying, in this episode, you kept saying that or going on about that. Just a bit of feedback. And we're like, let's try and not do that next time.
I mentioned about the classic podcast starting. Yeah, we're just going to see how it goes and have a chat because we just have such a laugh, and I'm sure you'll get all our own jokes that are really funny to you, even though you don't understand them. Have you got any advice on how people can really stay focused on that end goal and the reason they've started the podcast?
Yes. Number one piece of advice for that is to really understand what is the podcast trying to achieve. What are you trying to achieve from the podcast? And ensure that every episode is designed to support that overall objective. So I'll give you an example of Business Anchors. Really, our ultimate goal for this podcast is to help us drive new business. That is the honest ultimate goal of us putting all this time, resource, and energy into this podcast, is to attract new customers. And in terms of our focus, it's about ensuring that every episode isn't just fun to listen to. It's also... Sorry?
I was just representing fun by saying, hey.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
It's not just fun to listen to, it's also driving new customers. So the way we do that, you would have noticed in these episodes, is two things. One, trying to be really educational and informative and teach you anchors stuff that we're learning along the way.
Like Dan's doing now.
Like I'm doing now. But at the same time, the second stream of activity needs to be us talking about examples of the work we're doing for our clients, talking about the amazing brands we work with, like the BBC, like Wall, like Sunny D.
Like Dan's doing now.
Like Dan's doing now.
Oh, like he's doing it.
But not just that. I think it's more than that. It's still talking about the stuff we're doing, but then actually giving you extra advice from lessons we're learning. Like, we did this campaign for this brand. Here's how it worked out. Here's why it generated that £1 million contract for that safety gloves manufacturer. Because, and we've done episodes in this before, breaking down the content we've created, had an incredible hook. It was triggering emotion. It was really poking at the problem that the decision maker had. And we deep dive on that stuff. So it doesn't feel, hopefully, to you anchors, like this is a sales pitch. It's really educating you with examples and sharing stuff we're doing that's useful.
Because podcast is such a long form piece of content, a lot of people put loads of effort into designing social posts on Canva and things like that. And that's showing your audience something for a couple of seconds and communicating something really quickly. With a podcast, we talk in so much detail over such a long period of time. We're constantly mentioning things that show our expertise, and not necessarily in a way of like, right, we've noted down these 7 bullet points to show our expertise. It's just the genuine stuff coming through, and we talk about things that we're knowledgeable in, and we talk about our experiences, and you can do that too within your expertise and business. So you might have a completely different business. Maybe you're into interior design, and you're not like having podcasts saying this is why you should work with me on interior design, but you're having an episode about why lighting is so important in interior design
and how you do that well.
Yeah, throughout that episode you'll be talking about your experience with clients and how you've lit different homes or businesses in different ways. So you're showing your expertise and experience whilst educating and entertaining people. And I think that is the massive strength of podcasting, and the style of podcasting we do, which is we're not trying to get a massive our main income stream through sponsorship, although that is part of it. We actually manage to get most of our income streams through the podcast, through people working with our business.
My final kind of takeaway from the podcast is to really understand that it takes way longer than you think to have the level of success you want to achieve based on our experience. Like I said, that 1 year of producing a podcast every week, putting all that resource into it until we actually made enough money to ensure we weren't losing loads of money. So definitely be patient and ensure that along that journey, you're seeing the signs like downloads are increasing, you're getting good feedback that are showing that you're on the way to achieving that objective. Don't just blindly keep producing a podcast if no one's listening to it, no one's saying good things about it. But it takes longer than you think to get to where you want to get to.
Definitely.
How do you, like, on that point, Lloyd, how should anchors know when they should just give up? Like, podcasting isn't for everyone.
Yeah.
Like, if like us, we carried on going for a whole year and it was losing money, like, Why do we do that? What should they be looking out for to ensure that it's working?
I think 3 things. I think, like I said before, hunt down that genuine feedback from someone close to you or people close to you. Ask them to be crazily critical. And if that feedback continually is kind of like, oh yeah, it's kind of not, doesn't sound great when this happens, and like, oh, you don't really sound like you're interested, and there was this 20 minutes that was a bit boring, then over time I'd be like, oh, okay, this isn't really getting anywhere. Second time is look for growth over time, even if it's really slow. So, you know, on any piece of software like Buzzsprout or Spotify or anything, you can find the analytics. And if over time less and less people are listening, or if you started off with 8 listeners and a year down the line you've still got, you've only got 9 listeners, it's probably like, okay, this, I've given this a good crack and not seeing progress at the moment. And note that I'm not talking about income there. Oh, I haven't made any money. It's like, are people actually listening and enjoying this yet? If you're seeing improvements in that, then that will lead to the financial benefits. The third thing is asking yourself if you kind of love it or you hate it. I think if you see it as a chore, recording your podcast every week or every month or every fortnight, whatever it is, it's likely that it probably sounds quite shit to your listeners. So I think it's really important to ask yourself that and be really honest with yourself. Like, is this enjoyable? If it is, that's another benefit and you could carry on and maybe get to the point where it's growing. But if you're hating it, you don't really want to continue hating it for another 3 years and no one listen. And I've got a final point, Dan.
Go on.
It's like kind of depressing.
Okay, go on.
But I don't mean it to be too depressing. I've found the stats for how many downloads podcasts get, and the bottom 50% of podcasts, so literally half of all podcasts in the world, get less than 30 listens per episode.
Right.
So just think, if you're like, you might be thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to do a podcast because I'm going to get 20,000 listeners and it's going to get this income for my business. I think just want to give you the realistic thing that, like, if you're starting, it's likely you're going to have less than 30 listeners. And like, that's completely fine as a starting point, but don't get disheartened. That is the reality. I think you're going to have to start slow and build up. The top 1% have 4,000 listeners. Wow. You might get there one day. But yeah, it is tough. It will take work, but hopefully following some of the advice we've had, you can learn from some of the mistakes we made quicker and grow your podcast quicker.
And one of the best ways you can have a really good day and get really good luck is to review Business Anchors on whatever platform you're listening to it on, isn't it, Lloyd? Yeah. We've learned this in the past. Whenever anyone's added a review to Apple Podcasts or Spotify, they've always had a really good day.
I found the stats, and 37% of people that leave a review after listening to these episodes
win the lottery,
become a millionaire eventually.
Yeah.
So
it's crazy.
I don't know. Is it worth the risk of not doing that? I've got to ask ourselves that, really. I'm going to do one now. So,
same.
Yeah.
That's just the final point to leave you guys with, just to make sure, you give yourself the best chance.
Just want to help you. Just trying to help. Just doing what we can. Just trying to help.
So yeah, we'll see you in your ears next week.